EmMajority Report with Sam Seder.
The destiny of America is always safer in the hands of the people than in the conference rooms of any elite.
Sam Seder.
They are unanimous in their hate for me, and I welcome their hatred.
We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
EmMajority Report with Sam Seder.
Ever get the feeling you've been cheated?
It is Thursday, May 23rd, 2024. My name is Emma Vigeland, in for Sam Seder, and this is the 5-time award-winning Majority Report. We are broadcasting live steps from the industrially ravaged Gowanus Canal in the heartland of America, downtown Brooklyn, USA. On the program today, Daniel J Galvin, professor of political science at Northwestern University, author of Alt-Labor and the New Politics of Workers' Rights. And later in the show, Richard Beck will be with us to talk about his recent piece in the New Left Review entitled Bidenism Abroad. Also on the program, Nikki Haley, the media's favorite respectable Republican, has said she'll vote for Trump in the fall. Extremist Israeli Finance Minister Smotrich withholds funds from the Palestinian Authority in retaliation for 3 European countries recognizing Palestinian statehood. I just got signed out of my account here. All right, no, luckily I have my notes on this computer. There we go. Israel keeps bombing Rafah, despite reports saying the U.S. is pleased with Israel's updated military plans. At least 10 Palestinians were killed by Israeli forces in Jenin, which is in the West Bank, by the way. 13 Harvard students are deemed ineligible for degrees for participating in an anti-genocide encampment. Rick Skeletor Scott formalizes his thirstiness to be Senate GOP leader, officially announcing his candidacy. Senate Democrats look to revive the right-wing border bill they endorsed. But the one that Trump told his cronies to kill. Sam Alito flew not 1 but 2 January 6th related flags at his homes, plural. This one also has Christian nationalist ties and has been seen in Mike Johnson's office as well. Russia intensifies its attacks on Ukraine's second largest city, Kharkiv, killing at least 7 civilians earlier today. In the UK, Rishi Sunak calls for elections despite horrible poll numbers for the Conservatives. The DOJ sues Live Nation to break up Ticketmaster's monopoly. That's some good news. Families of the Uvalde shooting victims are suing local police for their horrific, cowardly response. And lastly, New York City begins a new wave of migrant evictions from its shelters. All this and more on today's Majority Report. Welcome to the show, everybody. It's an EmMajority Report Thursday. Google's just signing me out. Just randomly, all the time now. I don't know if anybody's experienced... Well, actually, I do know, because Bradley and I have talked about it. It's just signing me out all the time. I literally just signed in, like,
maybe
20
time for a
minutes
new
ago.
password or something. I don't know.
Hey, I don't know. I don't know.
Not to make you anxious at the start.
Yeah. This is like when our guest asked me about my personal finances. Oh God, I gotta get on that.
Dab some sweat.
I have an avoidant anxiety style in the sense that when I know I have to do something, I'll often just like avoid it, put it in the back of my mind.
Yeah, let's research Palestine some more.
Right. Let's stay up till 2 a.m. listening to the 4th interview with Ilan Pape tonight. Yeah, it's nice to know that Matt and I actually share some of those neuroses. It makes me feel a little bit less insane. But you know who is insane is the entire Republican Party. That's not news to anybody who's paid attention to this program. They are now convinced, or at least they're trying to convince their audience, that Joe Biden tried to assassinate or wanted to assassinate Donald Trump. Now, I had a sense that some in right-wing circles were going to go down this path when I saw Tucker Carlson just randomly bringing up JFK and the assassination plots surrounding that in order to draw some sort of false equivalence to the many questions about who was behind the killing of JFK versus Donald Trump, who is very much still alive, by the way. Like, if this would be really big news if we found out that there was some sort of botched assassination attempt on the former president. Is that what actually was the reality here? Well, first let's hear Maria Bartiromo's take on it. And she's basically just responding to a Trump's Truth Social, which might as well double as their production document.
Former President Trump calling out President Biden after learning that his administration authorized the use of deadly force during the FBI's 2022 raid on Mar-a-Lago during the classified documents probe. According to this filing, the DOJ and the FBI agents plan to bring standard issue weapons, ammunition, handcuffs, and medium and large-sized bolt cutters. They were also instructed to wear unmarked polo or collared shirts and to, quote, keep law enforcement equipment concealed. Trump posted on Truth Social this: crooked Joe Biden's DOJ, in their illegal and unconstitutional raid of Mar-a-Lago, authorized the FBI to use deadly force. Now we know for sure that Joe Biden is a serious threat to democracy. He is mentally unfit to hold office. 25th Amendment, writes President Trump. The FBI says this is normal, though. In a statement, the FBI said this: the FBI followed standard protocol in this search, as we do for all search warrants, which includes a standard policy statement limiting the use of deadly force. No one ordered additional steps to be taken, and there was no departure from the norm in the matter. Jonathan, I got to get your take on this.
Okay, pause it for a sec. So, good, they gave that context there. Is that going to inform their response here to that context, that it's standard procedure by the FBI? Will their own reporter's statement, let's put up this tweet here, Bradley, before we hear the response. This is Jackie Heinrich, who, let's just scroll over her bio here. No, her handle. White House correspondent, okay, occasional anchor on Fox News. I apologize. But anybody, someone who's worked with Fox News. A person from... Oh, she works at Fox. Okay, yeah.
She is the White House correspondent for Fox News, but she fills in sometimes as an anchor on Fox.
Okay.
She is a full-on Fox employee.
Good. I'm glad I wasn't confusing my blonde ladies here. News. FBI searches at President Biden's home also included deadly force policy, and then in parentheses, which is standard. I love it. The rest is in all caps. But below, a person familiar with the Hur investigation confirms that the standard Department of Justice policy statement regarding the use of deadly force was also included in the operations order for the searches at President Biden's residences in Delaware. Now, we had a caller call in with a theory about Biden's support for Israel, saying maybe he's leading us into World War III because he's so depressed about his losses and his very horrible losses of family members in his life because he has a death wish. This was not a satirical call, but it was a very big-brained thought. And I appreciated the creativity of the caller and what they had to say. But if that's really the case, right, that Biden has a death wish, so he's issuing warrants, or his DOJ is, for the search of classified documents on Trump's and his own, just to take them both out. I mean, that is a really elaborate plot by Biden where I just feel like he could go a different direction.
I mean, this is the trouble for Trump is he was just arguing in court. Supreme Justice Sotomayor said, Scottish Justice Sotomayor said, if the president decides that his rival is a corrupt person and he orders the military to assassinate him, is that within his official acts which he can get immunity?
Oh, that's good.
And the person said that could well be an official act. And he's like, you idiots, I'm not president right now. This is a liability to me.
That was the hypothetical. Okay, but anyway, so their own reporter acknowledging that this was in the warrant or the document for when they searched Biden's Delaware home. Will that stop this Fox guest from being absolutely hysterical about this? No.
Of deadly force. No one ordered additional steps to be taken, and there was no departure from the norm in the matter. Jonathan, I got to get your take on this as a prosecutor. Deadly force. Does that mean that Joe Biden was authorizing the FBI to if it came to that and he resisted arrest, it would be okay to kill Donald Trump?
That's what it seems, and I think
what does deadly force mean?
Yeah, that's exactly what it would mean. If you were in danger, you can use deadly force. What I find really surprising is the FBI saying they're using standard procedure. Well, this is a former president of the United States under Secret Service protection. Maybe you shouldn't use standard procedure. Maybe you go, if it was even necessary to get a warrant, you go there and you execute the warrant in the lightest way possible.
Lightest, yeah.
Okay, so
the lightest and the whitest.
I love how the entire right-wing media apparatus has decided that, wow, maybe police don't need to use deadly force in all searches and occasions, and perhaps the over-militarization of our police force is a bit of a problem when it comes to Donald Trump. But that realization stops at one human being.
Look, they actually shot at me. People don't even say, but I dodged all the bullets like Keanu in Matrix.
No, it really is amazing that you guys are saying about the two-tiered justice of system, two-tiered system of justice idea that they run with a lot in this very similar vein of boy, imagine if you weren't just talking about one of the richest, most powerful people in the world, and how many people are subject to an actual two-tiered system of justice every day of their lives.
Breonna Taylor, not to be...
literally.
To be
actually,
bring this. It's a funny segment, but Breonna Taylor was a victim of the shoot first and in raid mentality. That is not just. I understand that the FBI is trained better than local police forces, but the militarization of all our police forces trickles down to local cops.
And Breonna Taylor's family members aren't on Fox News every single day talking about a two-tiered system of justice. That's actually Eric and Don Jr.
This guy's literally saying, maybe we should have two-tiered justice. He's the former president. Be lighter on this guy.
And honestly, if this were a real assassination plot, they did it pretty poorly because they deliberately did the raid at Mar-a-Lago when Trump was not at home.
Yeah.
So, gosh, the FBI is both after him and incompetent because they didn't even know where Trump was located when they were trying to take him out sniper style, apparently. I mean, give me a break here. But we'll see how much staying power this is. I will also say it's notable that I think they're trying to graft onto some of the conspiratorial thinking that you're seeing coming out of the aggrieved RFK Jr. campaign, which is that Biden won't give him Secret Service protection because he wants him to be taken out as well. So this is just, I think, it's a part of Trump's legal strategy to cry and cry and cry. But if the media continues to harp on this, that's just the kind of, I don't know, conspiracy thinking that they appreciate that their audience engages in because it primes them for, everybody is after us, and when they're after Trump, they're also after you too. That mentality. All right, folks, a word from one of our favorite sponsors, Shopify. Some brilliant duos who helped us all make a leap forward. Socrates and Plato, Scottie Pippen and Michael Jordan, Eli Manning and Plaxico Burress. What about the perfect duo when it comes to growing your business? Shopify is the global commerce platform that helps you sell at every stage of your business, from the launch your online shop stage to the first real-life store stage, all the way to the did we just hit 1 million orders stage. Shopify is there to help you grow. Whether you're selling scented soap or offering outdoor outfits, Shopify helps you sell everywhere, from their all-in-one e-commerce platform to their in-person POS system. Wherever and whatever you're selling, Shopify has got you covered. Shopify helps you turn browsers into buyers with the internet's best converting checkout, 36% better on average compared to other leading commerce platforms. And I can say that from experience shopping on Shopify. Now, we use Shopify to power our merch store. We trust Shopify so much. But when I'm using Shopify as a consumer, I can just, the ease of it, anecdotally, I can say, incentivizes me to just pull the trigger and say, hey, maybe I do need, to get new workout outfits or something like that. I think that maybe literally something I did last week. Shopify powers 10% of all e-commerce in the US, and Shopify is the global force behind Allbirds and Rothy's and millions of other entrepreneurs of every size across 175 countries. Plus, Shopify's award-winning help is there to support your success every step of the way, because businesses that grow with Shopify. Sign up for a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/majority, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/majority now to grow your business, no matter what stage you are in. Shopify.com/majority. And thank you to Shopify for sponsoring the show. All right, quick break. And when we come back, we are going to be talking to Daniel Galvin. We are back, and we are joined now by Daniel J Galvin, professor of political science at Northwestern University, author of Alt Labor and the New Politics of Workers' Rights. Daniel, thanks so much for coming on the show today.
Well, thanks for having me.
So your book centers around how non-unionized workforces form organizations that can kind of better help them stand up to their employers, demand better conditions, better wages and rights. Alt labor groups, as your title indicates. How would you describe these organizations to our audiences, and like the conditions basically that they form in if they're, say, unable to be a part of a union?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the first way to think about this, or the best starting place, is to think about the conditions of low-wage work in the United States. And, you know, as some of your viewers may know, we have persistent problems in the workplace. There's rampant exploitation of low-wage workers, disproportionate number of whom are, you know, people of color, non-citizens, women. They suffer wage theft, discrimination, sexual harassment and abuse, unsafe and unhealthy working conditions. And so these are real live problems for a lot of people, millions and millions of people in the United States. And at the same time, what we've seen is a gradual but steady decline of organized labor and the ability of these types of workers to organize into unions and to avail themselves of the protections that American workers are promised by national laws like the Wagner Act, the National Labor Relations Act, that guarantees the right to collective bargaining. Although a lot of these workers are technically legally able to unionize, they find that in a lot of industries they work in, it's extremely difficult to do so. And then you have a whole swath of workers, farm workers, domestic workers, gig workers, right, who actually do not have the right to unionize. It's in that context where you have these workers who are exploited and seek redress for their grievances, that they've come together in these nonprofit organizations, non-union nonprofit organizations, to try to fight for their rights and contest their exploitation and do something to redress the extreme imbalance of power in the workplace and in society.
Farm workers and undocumented people, can you expand a bit on the situations that they find themselves in? Because we've spoken about this within the context of immigration on the show, how the threat of deportation is often used as a point of leverage from employers to employee for people that don't have documentation. Are those many of the people that you analyze in your book, people who basically have very little leverage against their employer because of their status?
So that does account for a significant number of the workers I'm talking about, but it's not like the majority. But you're absolutely right. I mean, you do have a situation in this country where immigration policy and labor policy are not well aligned, right? And so you have the ability for employers who are trying to extract more value out of their workers to, leverage threats, and it goes beyond the threat of termination, right? In this case, with the undocumented workers you're talking about, it's very common that they threaten, that they would report them to the ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, which really cuts to the heart of, what workers are doing here. In many cases, they're here to be with their families, right? And when their employer threatens to send them back, across the border, wherever it may be, they exert enormous leverage, right, over those workers. So yeah, that's a big part of the power asymmetry that we see in the workplace, and it goes beyond just termination. Yeah.
Right. And so the statistics bear out, obviously, that unions are substantially, if you're a member of a union, you're substantially less likely to have your wages stolen, or to have extreme unsafe conditions as well. But some of the groups that you've highlighted have also worked to, because they're outside of the formal process for whatever reason, better rectify the conditions in their workplace. What were some of the main examples that you'd like our audience to know about?
Yeah, so these groups, they're the umbrella term is alt labor, but it includes groups that are commonly known as worker centers, again, nonprofit groups that are community-based organizations. The alt labor term also includes like regional alliances of worker centers and other sort of community-based groups, also national alliances, like the National Domestic Workers Alliance. So these types of groups, they started out primarily trying to help their workers by, helping them file complaints when their employer steals their wages or discriminates against them, connect them to legal clinics and other legal services so they can exercise their private right of action to sue their exploitative employer. And perhaps they're most well known for what some of the groups call workplace justice campaigns or direct action, where they protest right out in front of the exploitative employer's workplace, bring public pressure to bear, right, on having an abusive manager fired, that sort of thing. And those sorts of campaigns are ongoing, and they're arguably one of the, it's sort of like the bread and butter of what alt labor groups do. But, over the last 20 years or so, a lot of these groups have realized that there's only so much they can do when they are sort of trying to rectify wrongs that have already been committed. They're like always behind the ball, right? Always trying to catch up, and sort of some call these workplace justice campaigns and complaints and lawsuits Band-Aids, right? Because it's not treating the cause of the problem, right? It's addressing the symptoms of the problem, which is fundamentally, this power asymmetry in the workplace and exploitative behavior by the employers. And so what they've done increasingly over the last 2 decades or so is turn to public policy, right? And go to sometimes federal, but mostly state and local government bodies, and including like executives, mayors, that sort of thing, but in particular legislation, to try to pass new policies that will, protect them against wage theft and give them some rights and protections that they can take advantage of through the legal system. It's sort of like, when you're vastly outmatched in terms of power, right, against these employers, right, who can fire you at will in the United States, can close up shop if they're investigated by the government and start up, a new business under a different name. How do you try to level the playing field, right? And so what these sort of poor, marginalized workers figured out is that they can appeal to the state, right, to the government, and try to use public policy and law to give them at least some tools, right, to fight back and to contest their exploitation. But if you don't mind me going on,
keep going.
They have also found, and they've been very successful in the policymaking arena, right? They've helped to increase the minimum wage in a lot of jurisdictions, passed anti-wage theft ordinances, health and safety, anti-discrimination policies. They've been very successful, kind of remarkably successful, which I talk about in my book. But they've found that in many jurisdictions, what we commonly call red states, right, even purple states and cities and counties, they are at a significant disadvantage in the policymaking process, right? They are also, relative to their opponents, employer associations and big business, they're really poor, really small. They're not mobile. Most of these groups are, community-based. And so it's really hard to get the policies they want. And when they do, the policies are often watered down, right, through the legislative process. So they've increasingly turned to more political engagement, right, trying to change the contours of the political system in which they operate so that they have, a more, an environment that's more conducive to the kind of policymaking that they're looking for. So happy to talk to you more about that, but that's the basic trend that I've observed, and I try to document in this book, is going from sort of complaints and lawsuits and workplace justice campaigns to public policy to politics, including electoral politics.
And the shift in policy over the past few decades has kind of put these groups in that position, right, where we have systematically weakened labor protections over a process of decades. This latest upsurge gives hope for the future in terms of just the kind of public sentiment around organizing and the wins that groups like the UAW and others have stacked up. But you talk about how it's a drift from labor law to employment law that kind of forces some of these groups to form and fill the vacuum that was left by labor law. Can you explain that process to our audience of how we got to that point from a statutory perspective?
Yeah, thanks for asking that. So, in the 1930s, Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the New Dealers passed the National Labor Relations Act, which they envisioned as, the great solution to the labor problem in America, right? This would be the way that, we could have fewer strikes, fewer disruptions of commerce, and also give workers a statutory right to bargain collectively, form unions and bargain collectively. And they thought that it would spread. I don't know how far exactly they hoped it would spread, but we now know, looking back, that it only got to about a third of the private sector in the 1950s. And then it started a sort of precipitous decline, right, in the 60s. And so in terms of the number of workers who have taken advantage of their collective bargaining rights to join unions. And so collective bargaining is the best, right? It's kind of the gold standard because it allows workers acting together to set, in a negotiation with their employers, the terms and conditions of their own employment. Right? So that can be tailored specifically to different firms and companies and different industries. And, it's like taking a scalpel, right, rather than something more blunt to the issue of workers' rights. But as fewer and fewer workers have found themselves able to take advantage of their collective bargaining rights, and this is a whole story about employer mobilization against unions, but also, anti-union forces in politics who have prevented pro-labor reform legislation from passing. So, this happened most recently during the first 2 years of the Biden administration with the PRO Act, right, which the filibuster basically killed. The anticipation of the filibuster made it impossible for advocates to keep pushing. So what ends up happening is that labor law is stuck in sort of a 1930s industrial world. It's what legal scholar Cynthia Esland has called it's ossified, right? The ossification of labor law over the last 70 or 80 years. And so, unions, starting in the 60s in particular, began pushing for employment laws, right? Which are, anti-discrimination statutes, protections for whistleblowers, everything that we now think of under the umbrella of paid time off, paid leave, family and medical leave, higher minimum wages, laws setting the sort of like the basic minimums of terms and conditions of work, right? And this allows workers two pathways of redress, right? You can complain to state agencies and the National Department of Labor, or you can file a lawsuit, right? The problem is, for a lot of low-wage workers who don't have the resources to hire a lawyer, right, or don't have, really strong English skills and have difficulty navigating the bureaucracy, these are really not effective protections, right, against exploitation of the type we're talking about here. So employment laws have proliferated, and they're they're something, they're good, right, but they're not enough. Unfortunately, though, short of reforming national labor law, it's sort of all workers have to look to. So, but I think it's worth pointing out that these employment laws that the alt-labor groups and unions have been pushing for decades now, they do chip away. I think of it as sort of chipping away at the power imbalance in the workplace. So consider like paid time off or advanced scheduling, right? Fair work week policies like we have here in Chicago. This is something where the employer has always had sort of carte blanche to schedule you for whenever they want, right? And you often don't get advance notice of what your schedule is going to be. Well, now workers in jurisdictions that have these policies have some modicum of control over their own schedule, their own lives. If they need to take time off to care for a family member who's ill, right? Or if they have to go to court to on a case of domestic abuse, they can do that, right? So it takes just a little bit of that power away from the employer, right? They legally are not able to prohibit you from exercising those rights. So it's sort of like baby steps, right, to giving workers a bit more power and leverage over their own working lives. And
some of the most common, I think, abuses that or maybe the most common, you can let me know, abuses that you do talk about is wage theft. Can you speak about the problem of wage theft and particularly how it targets non-union labor and how honestly ubiquitous it is? I think it's the number one in terms of dollar figures, theft. Right? If I'm not even saying it right, but number one in terms of dollar figures, in terms of how much money is stolen from somebody, basically, in this country. It's so common that and goes so undetected all the time, in part because we have such weak labor protections. How does wage theft fit into this dynamic?
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. It's a huge problem. And in fact, studying wage theft is what got me into this line of research in the first place. And I still do quantitative studies of wage theft. There have been some studies that have argued that it costs Americans more per year than retail theft and other types of theft combined, right? It's a huge cost. It's billions and billions of dollars that workers are not getting paid. It's sort of the extraction of wealth, right, from the business class and employers of workers who can least afford it. And what I study in particular is minimum wage violations because it's somewhat easier to study just because of the types of surveys I work with, but also it's kind of the most pernicious form of wage theft. It's when someone is entitled to earning the minimum wage, and that covers almost all low-wage workers. If they don't earn the minimum wage, and we find that about 20% of their income is usually lost. Among those who suffer a minimum wage violation, they lose about 20% of their income. That's a huge amount of money for people who are trying to live on really poverty wages to begin with. And so wage theft is one of, if not the biggest reasons why low-wage workers turn to worker centers and other alt-labor groups is because they've suffered wage theft. They know it's wrong. If you're entitled to a certain wage, which is poverty wage anyway, you know that there must be something wrong. Even if you don't know the intricacies of labor law and employment law, you know when your employer's not paying you. So that often brings folks in, and then the groups employ a variety of strategies, all the way from just asking the employer to can you actually pay this person? We noticed that they have received, they have a record and they have pay stubs or even just a journal of their hours, and you haven't paid them. Can you pay them back? Sometimes employers say, "Oh, sorry, I messed up. Here are your wages," but oftentimes they don't, and so the worker centers have to escalate. But the turn to public policy has been useful in a lot of cities. Like more and more cities now have their own offices of labor standards enforcement.
To interject, I mean, New York City's minimum wage is different than other parts of the state, for example, right? That you see that in other areas where a standard of living is higher, they've been able to raise the minimum wage on some of these companies.
Yeah, exactly. And, the first city to raise the minimum wage above the state level was San Francisco back in 2003, right, over 20 years ago. But what they found was that neither the Federal Department of Labor nor the California Labor Commissioner's Office was empowered to enforce that higher minimum wage. So they had to create an office, right? And so they created the first municipal office of labor standards enforcement in San Francisco. And have been beefing it up ever since, right? These agencies are usually really underfunded, and they don't have as many staff as they should. And so the effort now is to sort of really empower these agencies to go out and investigate really problematic industries, like food and beverage places, private households, which is a really tricky one but super important. Personal and laundry services like nail salons, meat packing plants. Agriculture, as you mentioned, is a big problem in a lot of places. And so it's a huge problem. It's one of the primary focuses of these groups. And
tipped work, I would imagine, is also a big part. When you mention nail salons and things like that, that seems like a situation where that's rife for that kind of exploitation that you describe.
Oh, it is 100%. I mean, the law says that if you are a tipped worker, you're entitled to $2.13 an hour. This is the federal minimum wage for tipped workers. And then your tips have to bring you up to $7.25, right? The current federal minimum wage. And if they don't, the employer has to make up the difference. Well, that is sufficiently complicated enough, right? And it happens in the shadows, right? Enough that it often doesn't happen, right? But I will say, even in places that have abolished the sub-minimum wage, which is great, the One Fair Wage campaign has done an incredible job of eliminating that in a lot of places, but it's an ongoing campaign. We still see the highest rates, some of the highest rates of minimum wage violations in the food and beverage industry, right? So it's still just an industry where people are regularly exploited, and continues to be a big problem.
Just a tip for people, no pun intended here. This sticks out in my mind. I remember getting my nails done one time, and there was a male owner of the business, and all the women there were working, and he kept insisting I give the tip in the envelope to him as opposed to as directly to the woman who had done my nails. And I remember thinking, no, and he was pissed because I walked back to point being, pro tip, give your tip directly to the person that's servicing you, because that was the energy that I got. But that's obviously just a personal anecdote. Daniel Galvin, the book is called Alt Labor and the New Politics of Workers' Rights. We will put a link to that book in the description wherever people are listening to or watching this. Thanks so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me on. Good to talk to you.
Good to talk to you. All right, folks, quick break. And when we come back, we'll be with Richard Beck, who has a great piece in New Left Review about Biden's foreign policy promises and what the status is of them now. We are back, and we are joined now by Richard Beck, senior writer at N+1 Magazine, author of the recent piece in the New Left Review, Bidenism Abroad. Richard also has a book coming out in September called Homeland, The War on Terror in American Life. Richard, thanks so much for coming on the show today.
Thanks for having me.
So your piece begins with reminding us, taking us back to the lovely 2020 campaign, where some of us had a lot of hope that was dashed quite quickly, where Biden had two central planks, really, that he centered his foreign policy promises around. And that was a foreign policy for the middle class, which he talked about, and that was, I think, in keeping with his withdrawal of Afghanistan. That was part of how he branded it, right? And that was a good action that he took. And then the other kind of ideological slogan was that it was democracies versus autocracies. Can you take us back to that moment and how those kind of two themes for his foreign policy got crafted?
Yeah, so I think during the Trump presidency, you had these figures within the Democratic Party's foreign policy establishment, people who now occupy very prominent roles within the Biden administration, like Anthony Blinken and Jake Sullivan, who spent those 4 years trying to come up with a foreign policy program that could beat Trump in 2020. And the two planks or slogans that they arrived at, as you said, are a foreign policy for the middle class and autocracy versus democracy. The foreign policy for the middle class, I think it's important to remember that these two slogans were formulated in the context of how do we win a political campaign? Because the idea wasn't specifically that every foreign policy action America took needed to actually help the American middle class. It was more that the U.S. would not undertake a foreign policy action under Biden unless it could say and plausibly argue that it would help the middle class. So like you said, the withdrawal from Afghanistan, that is almost the entirety of how Biden sold that withdrawal. Why are we continuing to throw money away on this expensive conflict that's dragged on for 20 years? That money should be reinvested at home, right? And this is around the same time that he's pushing things like the Inflation Reduction Act and this big infrastructure push, clean energy push. So that was the framing for selling foreign policy at home, which is important because foreign policy is often the part of what the federal government does, what the president does, that everyday voters feel the least connected to. And then in terms of this autocracies versus democracies, that became very urgent once Russia invaded the Ukraine. And when you think about Biden dividing the world into autocracies versus democracies, you can sort of read that as a metonym for countries that are aligned with the American-led, quote unquote, rules-based international order and countries that oppose it. And I think the Biden administration viewed Russia's invasion of Ukraine as being incredibly high stakes for the future of that international order. You've got numerous officials within the Biden administration saying when Putin invaded, if we don't stand up to Russia here, if Putin is able to succeed either by wiping out Ukraine or taking over large parts of it, the US-led international order may be done. Like, they saw that as an existential threat to US hegemony.
And it was actually kind of a sufficient analysis for them at the time, I would say, autocracies versus democracies as it relates to Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine, right? Because it was straightforward in the sense where they could make the case Russia is an adversary of the United States. They're engaged in imperial illegal invasion of Ukraine. They are also not a very democratic country, and so it's kind of a clean branding proposition. But then October 7th hits, and we're in a bit of an issue, a situation where the cracks in that kind of black and white thinking about the world begin to make themselves incredibly obvious, which is that democracies, when it expands outside of the narrative surrounding Russia, democracies versus autocracies, it's not quite clear, because many autocracies are put in place in the ashes and in the embers or continued legacy of colonialism and exploitation of the global south and other areas. And democracy, I'm noticing increasingly, from whether it be from Netanyahu or Biden, is basically being used as a stand-in to refer to Israel as, you know, they're one of us, right? They're one of the white Western countries, and they're civilized as opposed to the barbaric people on the other side, or, you know, some of the other kind of autocratic leaders in the Middle East who we very conveniently have propped up for our own interests. But let's not look at that at all. Let's just look at Israel as the only democracy in the Middle East. That is where I think you see this entire brand of viewing the world in this manner, as opposed to one of, like, power and colonialism, just entirely fall apart.
Yeah, and I think that was October 7 and the Israeli assault on Gaza that followed has been a real disaster for the Biden administration, in part because the Biden administration very much hoped from the beginning of his presidency to keep the Middle East out of the headlines. Like, that's also a part of the withdrawal from Afghanistan. The idea was the U.S. is no longer going to have this kind of direct military supervisory role in the region. We're going to hand off more of that responsibility to the reactionary governments who we are allied with in the region. And because we can hand off the direct supervision more to places like Saudi Arabia, and we can get these countries to normalize relations with Israel, was the whole idea behind the Abraham Accords, which the Trump administration, you know, kind of established, but Biden was very happy to pick that up and run with it. He really wanted to pivot to focusing on China and focusing on Russia, and to not have the Middle East and America's entanglements and support of reactionary governments in the region be what people were thinking about every day. And once October 7 happened, that became impossible.
And we'll return, I think, to Israel-Palestine in a bit, but I did also want to talk about the China piece of this, is because the U.S. empire and the foreign policy establishment has long wanted to pivot to China, right? And that has been discussed for decades at this point. But we were bogged down in the Middle East due to the endless war on terror. And that, I think, delayed this shift in terms of economic and military adversarial posture towards China. What has Biden's position been, just to recap, and where does that kind of antagonism, both economically and militarily, stand as it relates to China?
I think Biden's position with respect to China, it's interesting. It's basically, in its broad strokes, it's been the same as Trump's. And I don't think that you could describe Trump when he was in office as having a long-term geostrategic plan for American competition with China. Trump, right, thinks purely transactionally in terms of what benefits him personally. If something makes him look or sound good on TV, he's going to do it. Like, he doesn't care about the long-term geostrategic ambitions of the United States. But he started one of his popular campaign slogans, his topics that he would return to over and over again was about how China was ripping off the US. He's going to slap these tariffs on Chinese goods. China won't be able to continue, invading the US with its cheap consumer goods, all that kind of stuff. And when Biden took office, his administration basically said, we like a lot of what Trump did there. And again, we're going to pick that up and run with it. So you've seen a lot of what I would call fear-mongering over something like TikTok, as a Chinese-owned social media platform. You've got the Biden administration's recent tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles. The goal is, and Biden's laid this out very specifically in his national security strategy, they see China as the only country in the world that can plausibly hope to compete with the U.S. economically. And they want to make sure that the U.S. stays on top of that competition. So is it fair to say that Biden's foreign policy is centered around preserving United States hegemony, even if that hegemony has kind of been bleeding out slowly, I would argue, since the beginning of the 21st century, when the U.S. empire kind of laid itself bare to the world with the illegal war in Iraq? Yeah, I think it's fair to see Biden's foreign policy as defensive in that way. The goal is to preserve what we have. And actually, I would locate the beginning of the decline or, a crisis of American hegemony earlier than the beginning of the 21st century. I think you can look back to the 1970s when global growth begins to slow. And, the U.S. for several decades had been the leader of this world economic order that produced the most fantastic rates of economic growth that the world had ever seen. And at some point in the 1970s, that growth wave began to hit its limits. And decade by decade, over the last 50 years, average global growth has ticked down bit by bit, surely but steadily, slowly but steadily. I think, and I guess there was a temporary boom with like the Silicon Valley kind of uptick, right? But even that is still a product that's not physical and almost separate from certain trade elements. Well, I think you can view the period from the 90s up until now. You can see a few different attempts to juice growth, to get it back to where the U.S. thinks it needs to be in order for its hegemony to be secured again. And you have the dot-com boom of the 90s was one of those growth waves that ended spectacularly in 2000 with the dot-com crash. You can look at the Federal Reserve's decision to keep interest rates basically at zero for almost 20 years as part of that, saying, well, growth seems to still be slowing. Let's make it as easy as possible for companies to borrow money and move capital around. The housing boom of the 2000s is another instance of this kind of asset price inflation, where if we make homeownership available to many more people than previously, because housing is so labor intensive and mobilizes so many sectors of the economy, that's going to juice growth. And then that collapsed spectacularly in 2007, 2008. And now I think we're in the middle of a second tech wave of trying to paper over the contradictions and the weaknesses of the US-led economy with things like AI, where you have all of these fantastic promises being made that you sort of know at the outset can't ever be fulfilled, and certainly not on the scale that they're being, promised. But I think that, there's been this wave of successive attempts to kind of keep what America has, even as growth continues to slow bit by bit. And I also think that plays in then to U.S. military competition with China, because even if, as appears to be the case, we can't get global growth back to 4 or 5% annually, if the U.S. can hold on to a higher relative share of a slowing global growth pool, then it can still be the world's most powerful country, even if the economy as a whole continues to slow and fracture.
And the defensive posture that you talk about that the Biden administration is taking as it relates to foreign policy, I think is it's both defensive and then also, I would say, lacking in proactivity in terms of returning or restoring anything from the pre-Trump era, right? Where Trump thrashed about and did things, as you say, that were in his personal best interest or what he thought could appeal to the constituencies he wants to appeal to, like withdrawing from the Iran nuclear peace deal. The Biden administration has not restored that, and it doesn't seem like there has been much movement on that. I mean, I'm hopeful when I see things like the fact that they've established these back channels to, say, not spark a massive regional war after Israel bombed their consulate in, I guess it was Damascus, right? But, you know, that means, I guess, they're communicating with Iran, but they haven't worked to restore those kind of more formal diplomatic relations. And on the side, they haven't worked to restore the really good thing that the Obama administration did on this front, which was this peace deal. But they are working to further a Trump administration policy in the region, which is the Abraham Accords. So it's defensive, but the stuff that they're being proactive about as it relates to the Middle East is fairly far-right stuff that actually really only boxes out other potential Arab partners or any country in the Middle East that is not aligned with U.S. hegemony at this point.
Yeah, I think that's, in some respects, the lack of really sustained engagement on Iran and reviving the nuclear deal. In some respects, I'm not inside the White House or anything, but it seems to me like it might be a bandwidth issue, right? Like, there's Russia, that's taking up a lot of everyone's time. Now there's Israel and Gaza, that's taking up a lot of everyone's time. China, they really feel they can't afford to put that off for another presidential term, another 2 years, another 4 years. That's taking up a lot of everyone's time. There's only so much that a presidential administration can address minute to minute. And the plans that the Biden administration did have for the Middle East up until October 7 have all potentially just been exploded. So I think even there, at this point, something like the Abraham Accords, and the U.S. is still hoping that Saudi Arabia will agree to normalize its relations with Israel. I think you could also see that as primarily defensive at this point. It's still in pursuit of this goal, kind of white knuckling it at this point to, can we please focus on China and not have to spend every day working on these crises in the Middle East?
But I don't understand that line of thought. I know that's not your line of thought, but it's still, it's white knuckling it, right? But how does that not further bog the United States down in the region in that way? Because we know that was a part of Hamas's desperation on October 7th was the the fact that the White House, 2 consecutive White Houses have been pursuing this normalization deal with Saudi Arabia that doesn't even deal with Palestinian sovereignty.
I don't necessarily have a comprehensive answer to that. As opposed in terms of the Biden administration's thinking, I would say that at this point, part of it is that when, Biden came in, Trump had already kickstarted the Abraham Accords. A lot of work had gone into it. You've got a lot of America's allies in the region who are excited about it and interested in pursuing it further. And to move away from that and to say, no, we're going to go all in on a diplomatic push to bring back the nuclear deal with Iran, that's a huge lift at a time when Biden really wants to be laser focused on Russia and on China. And I also think it's plausible that Biden looked at what happened to the first version of the nuclear deal, which is that the instant a Republican took office, it was gone. And I think they've got every reason to expect that even if they were able to renegotiate it and reestablish it, would be painstaking, involve all kinds of politically costly concessions domestically. The second a Republican gets into office, it's gone again. So I think Biden has always described himself as someone who wants to work across the aisle, and I think that self-description is sincere. I think he was looking for a solution that Republicans wouldn't immediately dismantle the second one of them got back in the White House, and that trying to build on and strengthen the Abraham Accords seemed like the better bet.
And I guess just to return to where your piece began, talking about Jake Sullivan and Blinken and some of the people that have staffed his foreign policy, Brett McGurk. Can you talk about their ideological kind of leanings, their history, and how they were essential to crafting this this vision that I would argue is collapsing in front of our eyes?
Yeah, I think the most important figure of the three, as far as I can tell, is Jake Sullivan, who's been this up and coming, wonderkind star within the Democratic Party for a while. And I opened the New Left Review piece talking about a book by a journalist named Alexander Ward called The Internationalists, which is a kind of insider review of the Biden administration's foreign policy during the first 2 years of his term. And Ward is at Politico. He used to be at Vox. He interned at the State Department, the Council on Foreign Relations. Like, he's very much within this mainstream of the Democratic Party as well. And he's almost smitten with Sullivan in the book. He's quoting a Clinton loyalist describing him as a once-in-a-generation talent. There's kind of somewhat fawning descriptions of him as earlier in his career impressing the other staffers on Amy Klobuchar's Senate campaign with his ability to recall the lyrics to pop songs. He's been this rising star for a while. And again, he's one of the driving forces behind the slogan of foreign policy for the middle class. And I think Sullivan's intellectual acumen or ambitions or his creativity maybe get overstated a little bit in Ward's book, because it seems to me that what he's actually doing is coming up with a new way to package the old foreign policy, right? Which is just American hegemony forever.
Right. And packaging it in a way that is about defending democracy in that brand, right? So I guess that's where I return to Israel-Palestine. I mean, is it your view that this is a kind of a deep threat to the branding for the Biden administration as a government that's attempting to support the democracies and the will of the people abroad versus governments behaving in an authoritarian manner? And I should say, I think that these potential ICC arrest warrants for Netanyahu, when you put it next to the one for Putin, lays that contradiction pretty bare for the world.
Yeah, I think it's a disaster for America's image, and self-image. Let's say the federal government's self-image of the U.S. as a promoter of human rights, as a defender of democracy, as a supporter of a rules-based international order, because the Biden administration has made it perfectly clear since October 7 that none of the rules of the international order apply to Israel. One of the State Department or Defense Department spokesmen, I forget who, but in the early stages of the war, kept saying repeatedly at press conferences, we're not drawing any red lines with respect to Israel. Okay, well, if the international rules-based order is real, there's red lines for everybody. That's what a rule is. And the U.S. has been very explicit that Israel can do what it wants. And I don't think it's overstating things to say, yes, Biden makes these statements or has, these leaks to the press where an anonymous staffer just, Biden is always being described as very frustrated with Israel, very angry with Netanyahu. They're very concerned about reports that they've seen. This hasn't resulted in any of the concrete action that could meaningfully restrain Israel militarily in its conflict, like cutting off weapons in a real way. The U.S. is trying to muddle through and hoping that Israel can essentially get away with it, because Israel is America's most important ally in the region. And it is the single most important guarantor of U.S. Control over the region. And if this plan to step back from a direct supervisory role is to succeed, then not just Israel, but a belligerent Israel still needs to be in place. And if Israel were to face serious consequences for this war, if someone like Netanyahu were to be arrested and, brought before The Hague, that would be the end of the kind of belligerence that Israel has been accustomed to and that the U.S. has counted on for many decades.
When do you see that turning? When, the military intelligence, the strategic geopolitical benefits of having Israel so closely tied to the United States, the intelligence sharing, when did the benefits of that outweigh the cost? Because I'm hoping that's soon.
I don't know. Is the simple, sort of stupid but true version of the answer. I do hold out some hope that in terms of the election this fall, I hope very much that there's some urgency, even if it's self-interested, within the Biden administration that says we cannot be having this kind of death and destruction flashed across everybody's television and computer and phone screens in August and September. It's going to alienate too many of the voters who Biden needs if he wants to beat Trump. On the other hand, they're balancing that against the fact that Trump is a weak candidate and he's not very well liked and he's currently on trial. He's got other trials pending. They're really, really trying to thread a needle here. What I will say in the interim, I don't know that there will necessarily be a turning point, but in terms of America's ability to, command the compliance of the rest of the world, there was a quote from a piece in the Financial Times several months ago where someone at some international economic conference just said, the U.S. has lost the global South forever, right? The global South was already moving away from the U.S., in tentative ways, deepening its relationships with China, particularly economically with China's Belt and Road Initiative. And I think what's happened in Gaza since October 7 is only going to accelerate that trend.
Hopefully that's the case. Richard Beck, the piece is called Bidenism Abroad in New Left Review, and the book that is coming out in September is entitled Homeland, the War on Terror in American Life. Thanks so much for your time today, Richard. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right, folks. With that, we're going to wrap up the free part of this program, head into the fun half, where we will take your calls and read your IMs. Dizzle McFizzle writes in, just heard the EmMajority Report song. It is fire flame emoji. Left is best. How did you hear it? How did you hear it? I heard it yesterday. I was waiting for us to maybe have some graphics for it, but ultraviolet, very, very humbled. It was super cool and funny, and I was laughing to myself listening to it, enjoying it a lot. So I couldn't thank you enough. But is it released to the public yet? Dizzle McFizzle, I guess, has a...
Have you heard it?
I have heard it. Have you?
No, we should play it in the fun house.
I know, but do we have the I forgot to do to load it up for to put it in OBS or something like that. We're not gonna have the time to do that.
Bradley could just play it, can he?
Okay. And then we just put a break screen on? Oh gosh. All right.
We just show us listening to it.
Okay.
We don't need to play it for the transition. We just listen to it and do a react.
Okay. All right.
I think.
Okay, put yourself on camera.
I think if people make art for us, glorifying us, we should do it. We owe them at least a live reaction to it.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I'm fine with that. I wasn't sure if we were ready to do such a thing, if we were prepared.
We are the super producers over here.
Okay.
Look at Bradley. He's already got it.
All right, we'll do that in the fun half then. We will listen to the song and do a little bit of a reaction. On ESPN, we broke down the Eastern Conference and Western Conference finals on Monday, leading into both of them, although at that time, I guess it was we didn't know it was going to be Edmonton or Vancouver. Now Vancouver is eliminated. Anyway, but we also talked about the insane Harrison Butker story and how has connections to that Catholic sect that right-wingers were obsessively saying that was like being persecuted by the FBI. YouTube.com/ESPN show. Matt, what's happening on Left Reckoning?
Oh, well, on Left Reckoning also, we have Brandon here and Binder in just a second. We had Ryan Zickgraf on talk about our elites pathologizing rural politics. And also released onto the YouTube page, but in the postgame, we talked about Steven Crowder, his analysis of the ICC warrants out for Israel's leaders, and his analysis was they are gay.
Oh.
So we got deep into that and his riffing. So check that out. Go subscribe to us on YouTube, and that's what's going on in Left Reckoning.
Hello, Brandon.
Hello, Emma. Happy Thursday.
Thank you. Happy Thursday to you. What is happening on the discourse?
We're going to have something fun for our listeners, a little bit of a change of pace. We'll have a little movie talk out. Oh, I've been replaced. This is what they're talking about when they talk about that Gracious Plates and stuff. It's Matt. It's Matt taking over my box on Majority Report. No, we'll have a little bit of a change of pace out, get away from the news this week to do a little movie talk, and then we'll probably have another news episode out early next week as well. So a lot of excitement for people who actually still listen to my show.
All right. Well, everyone should be listening. What are you doing if you're not listening to the discourse? Matt Binder, hello to you. And what is happening on Doomed and Scam Economy?
Last night at youtube.com/Matt Binder had a live stream and a brand new episode of Scam Economy. I know it's about time, right? Had to cover this latest open AI drama and how they basically used or allegedly used or tried to go for some sort of voice that sounded like Scarlett Johansson's voice.
Total coincidence.
In the movie Her. Yeah, we still don't know because OpenAI is not open about anything. They literally don't share anything when asked to prove certain things. They won't even share the alleged voice actress's name, citing privacy concerns. And we all know people who work in entertainment never want credit for anything, and they don't want their name out there whatsoever.
It's the one. Sorry, Binder, but it's the one capability that tech companies or AI boosters will never promise. Despite we're gonna get exponentially better at doing this stuff, but we'll never be able to cite our sources.
Yes,
we have no idea. We can't do that. That's just impossible. Don't even dream about it, buddy.
Because they want it to feel like magic. They want it to feel like you're like it's coming out of thin air, because that adds like a layer of mystique to it. When you just realize it's normal plagiarism, that seems boring.
That mystique is the entire product.
Yeah.
All right, guys. 646-257-3920. See you in the fun half.
You are in for it.
All right, folks. 646-257-3920. See you in the fun half.
Oh, no.
Are you ready?
Who sent us this?
Alpha males are back. Boy is back, and the alpha males are back.
Just as delicious as you could imagine.
The alpha males are back. Boy is back, and the alpha males are back.
Just wanna degrade the white man.
Alpha males are back.
I take all of it in my throat.
Alpha males are back.
Snowflake says what?
The alpha males are back.
You are a madman.
And the alpha males are back.
Oh no, Sam Seder, what a fucking nightmare.